put that on first. Okay. Ready? Okay, so in our new City Hall, can I welcome members, guests and the public watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public might like to follow London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Now, the main item on the agenda today is our investigation into London's private rented sector. And today is very much an evidence-gathering session. We've got various people working in the sector, in policy in the sector particularly, here today, and representatives of private renters as well. So we're pleased to have a varied panel, and we'll have lots of questions for them later on. So can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Both, for whom Assemblymember Bailey is attending as a substitute, and under Standing Order 2.4, Assemblymember Cooper is attending remotely.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, Sean. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members and ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on the agenda?
Noted.
And none. Thank you very much. Item 3 is the minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the full... Hello?
John? Sorry, it's Leonie here.
Hi, Leonie.
Hi. I do actually own a flat, which I rent out, so... Technically speaking, I am actually a private renter sector landlord.
Thank you very much. That's a declaration of pecuniary interest, I guess, from the previous item. Well, so can we note that, please?
Not directly in the discussion, but I have well, I feel I ought to declare it, otherwise it's not transparent.
I think that's...
And it is a discussion that is going to be the main discussion for today. So
I think that's well worth doing. Thank you very much, Assemblymember Cooper. Right, so moving on to the minutes item now. Can we confirm the minutes of the formal meeting held on the 24th of November 2021 and the notes of the informal meetings held on the 18th of January and 23rd of February 2022? Thank you very much. Item 4 is our summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings in the agenda?
Noted.
Thank you.
Great.
Item 5 is action taken under delegated authority. So can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the letter to the mayor on overcrowding in London?
Noted.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. So that now brings us to today's discussion on London's private rented sector. So I want to first welcome all our guests and thank them for joining us today. I'll introduce you all briefly, but when we come to you, please do tell us more about what you do. First of all, we have Vicky Pearlman. She's the private rented sector programme manager for the GLA. Thank you for coming. Then we have Kate Webb, who's the head of housing strategy for the GLA. Thank you again for coming. Then we have Helen Masterson, the head of private sector housing standards from the London Borough of Newham. Thanks for coming. And then we have Claire Walden, who's the member solidarity organiser for the London Renters Union. Thanks for coming, Claire. And then joining us remotely via Zoom, we have Meera Chindooroy, who is the Deputy Director of Campaigns, Public Affairs and Policy for the National Residential Landlords Association. Thanks for coming, Meera. And Lynn Seller, the private sector housing manager from the London Borough of Haringey. Thank you for joining us, Lynn. So that's all our guests introduced. It's great to have kind of just point out an all-female panel today. And I've got the first set of questions. And like I said, we're going to dig into some various issues. And so my questions are sort of rather specifically to each of you in a named way. But if you want to join in or add a point, please do raise your hands. Or if you're on Zoom, raise your yellow hand or whatever colour it comes out on your Zoom. So my first question is to Claire. Claire, why, and we know this from data, we know that the decent home standard is met by fewer private rented sector homes than others. What's going on there? Why are living conditions worse in the private rented sector than anywhere else? And please tell us a bit more about your organisation if you wish to.
Thanks, Sean. London Renters Union, we are a union for renters, sort of mainly for private renters, but we also have members who are housing association tenants and people who live in temporary accommodation. If you live in temporary accommodation, you still have a private landlord or a estate agent that manages your home whilst you are waiting for a permanent home provided by your local council. In reality, people in temporary accommodation will live there for years, if not decades. So, yeah, those people are also our members. I think we probably all know the kind of history of why the private rented sector is as it is, but I think it is always important to say that there were decisions made in the 1980s which led to the mass sell-off of council homes. I always think it's interesting to look at the figures, like in 1991, 7% of people lived in the private rented sector, and by it's getting close to 25% now. So we have this boom in the private rented sector over the last decades. So what we have is a massively expanding and massively under-regulated private rented sector. So my job is, I'm not a policy expert, I work directly with members on their issues. And right now, the most common issue that we're seeing members facing is rent rises. Kind of, I guess there's a bit of a feeling that like the pandemic is over and things can get back to normal and we can hike rents again. And for our members, like a rent rise is basically the same as being served an eviction notice, because the option is you either end up paying an increased rent that you can't pay and you perhaps fall into rent arrears on, you're going to be served an eviction notice, or you try and bargain with your landlord and say, I can't pay this rent, and that your landlord can say, if you can't pay the rent, I'll serve a Section 21 notice and get someone else in instead. So there's a massive power imbalance between landlords and renters as things stand, and Section 21 is a big piece of that, of course. But we would also say that councils don't use their powers nearly enough. Councils have the ability to issue fixed penalty notices, they have the ability to issue improvement notices, and, you know, the data that we've seen through freedom of information requests show that councils are not nearly using the powers they have enough. We know councils are underfunded, understaffed, they've taken a battering with austerity. However, we think there's a lot more to be done, and that's why we're running a campaign in the run-up to the local elections this year called Side with Renters, which is actually focused at councils. Shall I stop there?
No, that's really useful. Thank you very much. And I'm moving on to asking some questions to the councils now, so that really leads on nicely. So, to Helen, first of all, you're a council. You do have this role in enforcement and complaints about the private rented sector. Why do you think there are more complaints about living conditions in the private rented sector in London than anywhere else?
Thanks, Sean. So I think what's happened, it was interesting what Claire was saying, because Claire was quoting the national average in terms of PRS, about 25%. So I just talk about Newham, where I oversee the private renter sector. Newham is quite unique. It's got the highest percentage of renters. It's 54%, our recent data, a staggering amount. And that has increased year on year, probably since I would say since the time of the Olympics and that sort of regeneration of Newham. So we've got a staggeringly big private renter sector. And why is that? I mean, I think we've got a lot of very old housing stock, and the PRS is disproportionate in the older housing stock. Older housing stock, so we're talking about pre-war, interwar properties. And I think 81% of Newham was built pre-1991. So because you have poor housing stock, you're going to get poorer housing conditions. And I think there was a real affordability about renting in London, and and therefore there's a temptation to overcrowd properties or to have them multiply occupied. And I think it's almost like that supply and demand. There's a massive need for good quality rented accommodation. It means that it allows a number of unscrupulous landlords to take advantage of those who want to have an affordable rent to live in London. We also know that the proportion of someone's rent in London is between 40 to 60%, or maybe they're average wages. So all those sort of factors together, I think, have led to this sort of melting pot where you've got a real demand for this type of accommodation. It allows it to be overcrowded. It allows, you know, the market pressures, unfortunately. So high tenancy churn, and because of that, what then that leads to things like fly tipping, rubbish, neglectedly looking of the private rented sector. If you go down a street in Newham, you can normally pick up the multi-occupied properties by the bins which are overflowing outside. And it really does bring down the whole street scene for other residents. And I think once you have that balance where you have more private renter sector, it then means that I think some of the owner occupants will then move out and then rent their property if they don't like the particular environment they're in. So it sort of led to that increasing level, I think, which has led to this particular issue that we've got at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you about what you're doing about that later on as well.
Yeah.
So the same question really to Lynn from Haringey. How does your housing stock and issues that you've seen compare with what Newham have just described?
Yeah, so very similar, to be fair. We're in a position where we, between 2019 and 2020, commissioned Tenure Intelligence in order to look at our stock and the possibility of utilising selective licensing as a tool as part of our enforcement toolkit. And again, similarly, since the 2011 census, that has seen our private sector housing stock grow from 31.5% to just over 40%. So we've seen a massive rise in the PRS. It's now our largest sector in Haringey, outweighing the social sector and owner occupation. Again, similarly, I think we have quite a stark east-west divide in Haringey, with west of the borough being quite an affluent area and the east side of our borough being least affluent. You know, you can see through our complaints system and just what we know in terms of other demographics that there is a lot more issues on the east side of the borough and a lot more issues with poor property management, poor property standards in the east side of the borough than there are in the west of our borough. Again, you know, we had, as part of the Tenure Intelligence, predictive modelling done on where our poor property standards are. But again, we've had to take into account, that similarly with Newham, the sort of age of our stock, which obviously has an impact then on whether the property has Category 1 hazards. So we've very much used information not just on our stock, not just on energy performance, but also looking at where our service requests are coming from to give us an idea of sort of generally where our poor property standards tend to be in our borough. And we've used that information obviously to put forward our proposal and the need for us to have additional enforcement support through selective and other property licensing. We've got a borough-wide licensing scheme in Haringey for houses in multiple occupation. And that was following 2 smaller pilot schemes that we had in various areas of the borough. So yeah, very similar picture really, and I think the growth is very much mirrored in that the private rented sector is one of the only sectors available to an awful lot of people now, and also the fact that a lot of our housing need is now rolling out to the private rented sector as well. So there's a growth just purely because there isn't enough social housing available to residents, that we're using the private rented sector now in areas where we would have used our social sector.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Can I just ask one clarification about what you've both said, actually, about the older properties being more of an issue for complaints, but the owner-occupied sector has much lower levels of non-compliance with decent homes, much lower levels of hazards, I think. Is there something about the nature of the PRS that landlords don't maintain these older properties in the same way? Is that something you've noticed? Helen, go on.
Yeah, step in first. So I think what happens is that in terms of, and we're going to probably talk about enforcement and some of the points I think that Claire brought up and why that's actually, why there isn't as much enforcement going on. So in terms of landlords, there is nothing in law proactively which requires them to maintain their property at the moment outside selective licensing, which is what Lynn was talking about. So outside that, which is a discretionary scheme that has to be approved by your council as well as by a Department for Levelling Up if it goes ahead. So all the legislation at the moment is very reactionary. There is a problem, there's a leaking roof. It requires an officer to go along, identify, speak to the landlord, serve a notice, and then the improvement happens. There is nothing in law at the moment that says that a landlord must maintain this to a certain standard at the moment. So I think that's where the difficulty arises. When you have licensing in place, a large-scale licensing scheme, at that point you're proactively requiring landlords to identify who they are, to actually do pre-tenancy checks, to do maintenance checks, and to deal with, to a basic minimum standard. So that's where licensing is the only legislation which is discretionary that actually proactively requires a duty on landlords to manage their property. So I think that's what the fundamental issue is. And our whole legislation, going back to Housing Act 2004 and the powers under improvement notices prohibition, they are reactionary. It requires a local authority to intervene in order for that improvement to actually happen. It doesn't require landlords to off their own back. So, and I think in that supply-demand market, it means that we find that most landlords are trying to do their best to comply. If you give them the information and you say, this is what you need to do, they try to do that. They may need some help along the way, and we try and help them. But there is an element of the rogue landlords, the ones who are out there to absolutely exploit our residents, who don't have a great voice. A number of the times they may be a bit under the radar. They may not want to raise because they're fearful they may lose their property, be evicted. So they don't want to make complaints. So you have this unlevel relationship going on, unfortunately. So that's where I think it comes back to why there is, this issue in London, and why we don't get, and I think Lynn will probably say this, we don't get lots and lots of complaints. We get some complaints, and through the Renters Union has been really good through local organisations who flag cases up to us. But we don't necessarily get lots and lots of complaints year on year, no matter how much we try. It's a very hard to reach group of residents and tenants, private rent, for various reasons, that they're not as vocal as they would be. So I think, to me, that's what the fundamental problem is. And we're probably going to talk about levelling up and there's potential to try and put that right.
We will, yeah, but that's really helpful. Yeah. Thank you. Lynn, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I do need to move and allow Meera the right of reply on this. And you are the next person I'm coming to, Meera. And I think, I'm sorry, Helen, can you turn off your microphone? Thank you very much. So Meera, you represent the landlords, and I think you can explain to us that your organisation is a merger of two previous landlord associations. So you represent a big chunk of our landlords, and I think we've established that the older properties are more of an issue, that potentially there's nothing inherent in the older properties that makes them impossible to bring up to standard, but there's not a lot of incentives. Is that what you find? And is there anything you've noticed in a change in what landlords are like, if that makes sense, the type of people who are landlords? We've seen, reported by Newham and Haringey, a big growth in the number of private sector rented homes. We know that most landlords don't own that many homes, so that must mean a big increase in landlords, if that makes sense. And have you noticed any changes in the composition of what landlords are like? So yeah, anything you want to tell us about those things, please, Meera, and hopefully you could hear all of that.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm representing the National Residential Landlords Association. We represent over 95,000 private sector residential landlords in England and Wales, and provide support and advice to our members, and seek to raise standards in the private rented sector through our code of conduct, our advice line training and accreditation, and the provision of guidance and updates on legislation affecting the sector. We also seek a fair legal and regulatory environment for both landlord and tenant, and actively campaign on behalf of our members for a rental sector that works for all. So in terms of the conditions in the sector, of course, no tenant should have to face living in accommodation that is not safe or acceptable standard. And those landlords who are providing such housing should either make sure to rectify that problem or leave the market altogether. But I think it's important to also recognise that there are, this is very much a minority of tenants who are facing under standard properties in London. a higher proportion of private renters in London are satisfied with their accommodation than social renters, according to the English Housing Survey. So 84% of private renters are satisfied, compared with 76% of social renters. Private rented households in London were less likely to be overcrowded than those in the social rented sector. And the vast majority of private rented households in London, 78.8%, are satisfied with the repairs and maintenance in their properties, which is the second highest proportion in the country. With regard to the Decent Home Standard, I think it's important to remember that the Decent Home Standard was designed to improve standards in the social sector. We know that the proportion of private rented homes in London that have fallen below the Decent Home Standard has reduced by over half since 2006. So its standards are improving in the sector, and I think I would agree with the previous speakers that spoke about the challenges around enforcement in trying to address those minority of landlords who are providing substandard homes. There is also a challenge in terms of the older properties, because the Decent Home Standard does require certain structure of the property, layout of the property and so on, that isn't seen in older properties, and the private rental sector does have the highest proportion of pre-1919 accommodation in compared to the other tenures. So there is a particular challenge with older properties, which I think we continue to see with regard to meeting some of those requirements in the existing Decent Home Standard. And that's why we are developing proposals for a Decent Home Standard, which would work for both social and private rented homes. And I'd be happy to share that with the committee when those proposals are finalised. To address the issue which was raised around licensing and the sort of proactive versus reactive requirements of maintaining properties, I don't want to give the impression that landlords aren't required to maintain standards in their properties. There is the Housing Health and Safety rating system, which sets out the requirements for properties, and private properties need to meet these requirements just as much as other types of properties. It is true that local authorities can only seek to inspect properties if there is a reason to expect that there is a challenge in the property. And I think one of the challenges we see is that many tenants don't know their rights in terms of how they can make a complaint about the property and the process to do that. So I think improving that awareness amongst tenants around the role of the local authority in enforcing the standards that are available is really important. And it's also important to recognise that licensing isn't the answer in and of itself. Having a licensing scheme doesn't mean that there's going to be more enforcement in that area. And we know from FOI requests of our own for local authorities that there's a real challenge around enforcement both in licensed and unlicensed areas. So I think the challenge to ensure that the standards in the sector are maintained and improved is around improving that enforcement action from local authorities, which means local authorities prioritising this and also seeing more funding from central government to support local authorities alongside the provision of the funding that's available through the civil penalty scheme.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. I noticed that Kate from the GLA had your hand up.
And apologies if this sounds really pedantic. To be clear, we really welcome the work of Meera's organisation. They do an awfully good job to sort of recognise the challenges in the sector and go some way towards professionalising it. But Sean, you did say at the outset that I can't remember if it was a chunk or a proportion of the landlords are sort of represented by these bodies. And I think it is important that we all recognise that actually that's not the case. Helen rightly talks about private renters being a hard-to-reach group, but so are landlords. You know, very, very few of them are actually part of these professional bodies. And that does mean, it reflects the fact that, you know, often these are amateurs who have sort of stumbled into an investment idea. But it does mean they are very hard to reach when it comes to setting expectations and educating them about changing requirements. And I know we'll get onto solutions later, but that is one of the reasons we're so keen on a register. But I just thought it was important to clarify that landlords they're not an easy group to represent when we're having these kind of discussions.
I think we need to go back to Meera just briefly on that in that case. So Meera, what proportion of landlords do you represent in that case? And do you also find it hard to reach them? And that's one of the original questions I asked, I think, is, you know, what's changed about landlords? Is it that they are more invisible?
Yes, sorry, I missed that question in my response. So, as I said, we represent over 95,000 members. There are over 2 million landlords in the country. So it is a small proportion of members, but around 10% of the total housing stock represented in the private rented sector. What we've seen over recent years is actually there's a consolidation of portfolios in the private rented sector. So more of those landlords with 1 or 2 properties are leaving the sector, and we've gone from a majority of landlords having 1 or 2 one property to just under half of landlords having 1 property across England. So there is a move towards larger portfolios as a result of a number of different changes that have happened in the sector. It does remain a challenge to reach landlords because of just the number of landlords that there are in the market. But one of the proposals that we have, the government is planning to bring in compulsory redress for private landlords, and we believe that we support this proposal. We're actually running a pilot redress scheme for our own members at the moment, and we believe this will provide a way in which communication with landlords can be improved, because landlords will be required to be registered with a redress scheme, and therefore there will be an easier way to reach all landlords.
Okay, thank you. We have more questions about that later on, and obviously that already came in for letting agents, but not landlords yet. Now I'm handing over the questioning to Assembly Member Moema now for more to dig into more of these issues.
Thank you. And nice to meet you all. I just wanted to add, as you were talking, Kate, I think it's about 3.5% that the NRLA represents. There's 97% of private landlords, which are not some of the good ones, or we don't know whether they're good or bad or indifferent, just to make that point. But I just wanted to ask to Helen, Lynn and Meera, why are there more complaints about living conditions in the PRS in London than anywhere else? And I take your point about people being hard to reach, but it should be really good to get your thoughts on that.
Shall I go, Lynn? So, okay. So why are there more complaints? I think, so I just, perspective of Newham that I can sort of really comment on. So I said we've got over 40,000 rented properties in Newham alone. So the private rent sector in total is, I think there's 120,000 houses, 60,000 private rent sector. Some of those are exempt for various reasons. But on our current licence scheme, just over 40,000 at the moment, of which around 36,500 are what we call single family dwelling type, selective type properties. And the other sort of 3,500 are various multiply occupied, either mandatory or smaller, what we call additional properties. So why the more complaints? I think we talked about the older housing stock. We also talked about how cold it is. We've got a real problem with very cold properties, and we have a number which we've been finding which have been rented out against the current laws, which are what we call F and Gs throughout the borough. So we have issues with that. We have issues with in terms of complaints. The other thing is what you find, going back to the point what Meera was saying about the number of landlords. So of those 40,000 properties, we have 26,000 individual landlords. So we have a real issue with one property landlords and not that many with portfolios. So in terms of professionalising the organisation, it's very difficult. And we work quite closely with the NRLA as well, who provide quite a lot of support if you are a member through their organisation. I think the difficult we have is we talked about engagement with tenants being a hard to reach group. Exactly. Engaging with landlords is also a very hard to reach group as well. We have 17,000 who have opted into our email. So we do like 3 or 4 bulletins a year where we try and update on the various issues going on. And we often have the NRLA will input into that. And we have a joint conference. We invite landlords along. I get very, very few landlords who turn up. I think Newham has probably got a particular challenge in terms of landlords whose first language may not be English. It may not sort of engage in that manner. So we are looking at different ways that we can engage, working through faith communities, through mosques, working through, we have a faith committee, and using sort of community leaders as a way of going through to try and influence in that respect. So it's a really difficult area to try and, we talk about raising those awareness of standards amongst tenants, to let them know that they can complain, and landlords. So in a way, we don't have that many complaints, but we have some really poor conditions. We have some, I think, tenants who are suffering but don't know how to complain and get through to us. So that is a real challenge for us as well. And that's why licensing, because it has that proactive element on it. It sets out to landlords, this is what the standards you should meet. These are the pre-tenancy checks you should make. You need to give us a copy of your gas safety certificate, electrical safety certificate. You need to go and inspect your property and check who's actually living there. Are the people in your tenancy the people there? Has it been very multiply occupied in the meantime? We've got a real issue about rent to rent as well going on, which is where it's sublet to one tenant, head tenant, who then sublets it to further tenants without the landlord actually knowing about that. Then there's problems about disrepair, overuse of the property, normally antisocial behaviour complaints from the nearby neighbours, and then we get involved, and then there's a lot of things then to go and try and sort out who is actually liable for it. And that's a very complicated area at the moment, because we're, in terms of the recent case law judgments coming back, they haven't been very helpful towards local authorities to be able to chase the correct party. So there's an issue about that as well. Managing agents, letting agents, there's an issue there about not protecting the rent deposit. There's all various legislation. And we've been doing quite a lot of work with our letting agents and managing agents and find a number of problems there where we're issuing fixed penalties. So I think it's a real melting point. There's a whole load of reasons. It's the supply and demand issue. Everyone's trying to find somewhere reasonable to rent, over-occupying a property. And I think, and landlords not being professional, not being aware of what the standards should be as well, what they're understanding. And one thing Meera's mentioned about the housing health and safety rating system, which is the main way of actually assessing if there are risks in a particular property and if there is repairs to be done. The problem with that system is it's very bureaucratic. It's overly complicated. It involves a number of numbers and churning. And to be honest, officers struggle with it, as well as landlords. If you say to a landlord, oh, we've calculated it as a category 1, they don't actually understand what that means. It's not a common sense, unfortunately, the way it's gone. It's not a common sense standard. And that's one of the reasons that Claire was talking about and saying there isn't as much enforcement amongst local authorities in terms of serving notices. And that really is why. Because for an officer to come back, to do those calculations, to then be challenged potentially under appeal, to go through a first-tier tribunal, they have to take all those things into account to make sure they've got all the right evidence. And it's very, very time-consuming. Going back to the licensing point of view, the licence, we automatically know who the landlord is. So we actually get a lot of work done, which doesn't need notice, because someone is complaining about a broken window. We can ring the landlord up. We've got them on speed dial and say, right, broken window, go and sort it out. And the majority of that stuff gets sorted out very, very quickly, because landlords generally want to be compliant, most of them. They just don't quite know how to be compliant. They just need to have that information up front in order to be able to be dealt. So I don't know if that actually helps, gives a bit of a flavour, a bit of insight why there is such a big issue and why there is a lot of disrepair and problems out there.
You know,
in
it
the private
does.
rented sector.
I mean, I think your point before about the number of complaints that you do or don't receive, in an ideal situation, you would have that relationship where something could be fixed rather than have to go down an enforcement route, which might involve going to court. But if I could just ask the same question to Lynn, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, you know, Newham and Haringey, you know, I think probably any London borough, to be honest with you, is going to mirror and have very similar problems and situations. I mean, in terms of numbers of complaints, you know, we do at Haringey get a lot of complaints from our private sector tenants, but also from organisations that we've now developed partnerships with who are complaining on behalf of tenants who ordinarily probably wouldn't have a voice or wouldn't necessarily know how to access council services in order to complain, or have a deluded sort of appreciation of you know, what standards they should be expected to live in. So quite often don't complain because they don't, you know, that they're not recognising that actually they're living in standards that they shouldn't be living in. In terms of whether we've got more complaints about poor property condition in London, I mean, we could switch that and say, well, it's good that tenants know how to complain and that tenants are actually now complaining about their poor property conditions, and that we've done a good job in making tenants feel that they can come forward and making and educating tenants on the actual standards that they should be living in. And so when the property standards fall, that they are able to access our council services. So we could flip it and say that maybe we're doing a good job in the sense that, you know, we're now encouraging people to come forward and not to be frightened about any type of retaliatory evictions or retaliation from landlords if they do complain, and we're, you know, empowering tenants in that way to come forward. But similarly, you know, mirroring Newham, you know, we're in exactly the same position in terms of how we deal with those complaints. I do think that you know, we can't get away from the fact that as local authorities, we've probably in the past not utilised the HHSRS, so the Housing Health and Safety Risk Rating System, as it should be. And I think, you know, tenant churn in the past has meant that landlords have got away with doing, you know, a small amount of repair rather than, you know, a good renovation job. A new set of tenants have come in, it's a quick lick of paint, it's a bit of, you know, covering of the damp and mould. Those tenants live there for however long, and they then move out with exactly the same problems as the previous tenants. And yeah, and there's another churn of tenants that move in that have to kind of go through the same rigmarole. And I think as local authority officers, you know, having the licensing schemes, which I know, you know, are, you know, chalk and cheese in terms of landlords don't like them, but local authorities do like them, because we do have that ability to have a proactive inspection programme. In Haringey, before we had our borough-wide scheme, which became operational in 2019, we inspected every single multiply occupied property before we issued the actual licence, which allowed the officers to identify all the failings in terms of statutory standards at a property. And then when we issued the licence, that landlord would get a very specific schedule of works in terms of that property and what they needed to do to bring it up to the standard where it failed, and a time frame to do it in. And if they then didn't comply with that schedule of works, we then went on to take enforcement action. And by doing that, we've been able to build relationship with our landlord. We're supporting our landlord. We're trying to create ideas. If it is, for example, there's not enough kitchens to bathrooms to numbers of tenants that are in a property, you know, we're not leaving landlords to go away and resolve those issues on their own. And I think that has kind of helped Haringey build that relationship in the past by having those schemes and showing that we're not just there to beat the stick, but we are there to kind of encourage and to work with landlords to resolve some of the issues. And I do think that sort of having that wider collaboration that you get through licensing schemes, working with other council departments, planning enforcement, for example, it kind of does provide that kind of holistic approach to dealing with problematic properties. And, you know, as Meera said before, some of the older stock properties, you know, the layout and style of the property doesn't actually necessarily warrant them being used multiply occupied rented properties. And so it's kind of working alongside landlords to make sure that we are nipping in the bud some of those continuous complaint problems that come up each cycle of tenant that goes in and moves out, and trying to sort of iron out those long-term problems. So yeah, I think we have exactly the same sort of problems as any other London borough in Haringey, and it's just getting the staff to
I'm really sorry, just in the interest of time, we're slightly overrunning, and I don't know whether... Should we move on to the next section?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to get a perspective from Claire at this point.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think Claire is... Claire? Yes, please.
I just want to quickly come back on the idea that sort of landlords with big portfolios are the solution. Sem, you're a Hackney resident, and you know about Somerford Grove, which was a block where renters got organised, and the leaders, the block organisers who were knocking on doors, they got served Section 21 notices by the large company, the billionaire owner that runs it, because they wanted them out, because they did not want those residents to be organised. In Lambeth, there's Dorchester Court, where we have more than 100 members. Property Partners, the owners, the agency who run that block, they have been served 2 improvement notices by Lambeth Council, most recently for lead poisoning. And what Property Partners are insisting on saying is the only way that the lead piping is going to be replaced is by moving everyone out. And they also have a planning application in to build penthouses on top of Dorchester Court. So I would really question the idea that big landlords kind of resolve the issue. What we see is that big landlords who have huge amounts of wealth can be incredibly intimidating to renters who want to get organised to improve their conditions and don't necessarily actually maintain properties better anyway.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Claire. That's really helpful. I need to move on, but it seems like I should give Meera right of reply very briefly, if you can, on that. Who has her hand up?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that one of the challenges around complaints is that actually when we've asked local authorities, many local authorities don't actually differentiate between complaints that have been made about private rented properties and social rented properties. So nationally, more than half of local authorities were unable to provide accurate numbers for complaints about the private renters sector, and having a selective licensing scheme doesn't improve this. 61% of selectively licensed local authorities across the country weren't able to provide accurate records. So there's a real challenge around the records that local authorities are carrying. And in terms of landlords' perceptions of licensing schemes, one of the common complaints we get from landlords is that they've paid for a licensing scheme, but there has been no inspection. So the existence of a licensing scheme doesn't mean that there's going to be an inspection in the property. It's interesting that Haringey has undertaken that before they've issued a licence, but that isn't the case in many local authorities. And I think it's important to recognise that it's not just the existence of these schemes that makes a difference, it's the actual enforcement of them.
Thank you very much. Now, we need to move on to further questions from Assembly Member Cooper. I just want to check you're ready online, Leonie. Brilliant, excellent. I'm handing over to you then. Thank you.
Here I am. Thank you, Chair. I think it's really interesting the way that this discussion has been going. The idea that it's up to the tenants to have to contact somebody like a local authority, because I think we actually just need to, remember what has happened to local authorities. I mean, we blithely, I think it was Claire who sort of, mentioned very briefly the situation with local authorities. But, there has been this massive reduction in the amount of money that they have got. 65% of their funding has gone. And that means that councils have been forced to cut back their services. and they have 46,464 less staff working in London boroughs from 2010, and that figure is from 2017, and there have been further cuts since then. So I actually think it's really difficult for tenants to effectively get redress, given that this is against a background of 500,000 more households that have formed in London since 2010, of which at least 27% across London are in the private rented sector. And obviously certain boroughs such as Newham, as we've just touched on, have a much higher percentage. So we're talking about a situation where it's actually really quite hard to get hold of somebody to come and help you. But supposing you are able to do that, what forms of redress, and I'd like to go to Claire for this, because I'm sure she feels very strongly about this and has got some idea. What forms of redress can tenants actually get should they be facing disrepair or anything else from a rogue landlord? Thank you.
So one way is to try and get support via the legal system. So if you have been subjected to kind of persistent disrepair, an illegal eviction, which a lot of our members have experienced, a violent illegal eviction when landlords come in and throw people out into the street, sometimes in the night, or persistent harassment, you can kind of try and get legal support. One of the big issues that we have around this is legal aid has massively been cut, and a lot of our members are not eligible for legal aid. Their income isn't low enough. The threshold to get legal aid is extremely low. So theoretically, you can do things like get an injunction to prevent your landlord from coming into your home whenever they like to harass you, or you can kind of win damages in court for disrepair. But as I say, there's a big barrier around the fact that there is not access to legal justice for a lot of renters.
I mean, there's the problem with legal aid, but in terms of court backlog as well, where are we on that? Because I know that impacts on a lot of other cases, Claire, but is there also a backlog on dealing with disrepair cases that you might wish to take against your landlord? I'm assuming there must be.
Yeah, my experience of the legal process is it's incredibly slow. Many years. I guess like a member who was illegally evicted in 2018 or 2019, it took 3 years for that legal process to conclude.
So talking about disrepair, let's say that someone's got defective heating, you know, you're in a situation where somebody might be waiting years and years and years to get the boiler fixed, and could be living in a really cold private rented place and unable to sort that out.
So in that instance, with our members, we would do a couple of things. One would be to kind of put pressure on the local council to, for example, issue an improvement notice on that, or take some kind of action. As a union, we also would take action with our members. So if, for example, there's an estate agent who are letting this boiler not work, it's winter, our member is cold, we would kind of picket the estate agent. That's a form of redress that we can do, and we find that it renders results a lot quicker than the legal system often does. What I would say is there is not that many easy forms of redress for renters, and as kind of Lynn and Helen have said, particularly for renters who speak English as a second language or haven't lived in the UK for a very long time, who don't understand kind of how the systems work here. It's incredibly hard for those people. It's incredibly hard for those people to get redress.
Do you think there's also barriers because quite a lot of people now in the private rented sector are living there with children and perhaps are fearful about going for some form of redress because they fear they might be evicted? And of course, we've also seen the growth of older renters. So people who are, you know, perhaps retired and have maybe lived somewhere for a long time, but of course, you know, people with mortgages, they pay them off and then they don't have the mortgage anymore. So people who are privately renting still have that financial burden, and they might be worried about trying to take redress against their landlord.
Definitely, and for good reason, because you know, when renters do complain about conditions, there is I would say not a tiny proportion of landlords, I would say there's a sizable proportion of landlords who respond by saying, if you don't like it, you can leave. And ultimately, until there are secure tenancies for private renters, I do not see that conditions will improve, because landlords can simply say, if you want a fixed home, you can move somewhere else, and issue a revenge Section 21, which is incredibly hard again to prove legally, even though it's not meant to happen. It does happen a lot.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Meera, because I think we need to hear from the landlord side. And you heard me saying at the beginning, Meera, that I myself rent out a property. I just rent out one property, so I'm one of those landlords that has just a very small portfolio of one. It has a very high-rated EPC, and I usually try and issue annual or even 2-yearly tenancies to people, and try and make sure that any disrepair issues are fixed as soon as is practically possible. I have annual gas checks and PAT testing and all the things. So there's no question of any kind of, a situation where I feel very comfortable to rent out my flat and have rented it out for periods of up to 5 years to people, which I think no one would stay for 5 years if it wasn't somewhere where they wanted to live, and that has included hairdressers and nurses and people who I feel that need accommodation in London. But and so I would hope that nobody would ever feel that they need to take redress against me as a private sector landlord. What can your organisation do, and what do you think about the balance of the power relationship, if you like, between the tenant, the occupant and the landlords? Do you think it's become unbalanced? Do you think tenants are actually being sufficiently given enough opportunity to seek redress? Should they need to?
I think, as has been discussed, there are limited opportunities for redress at the moment, so that the tenant can either complain to the local authority, but not always will local authorities follow up that complaint, or they could go to court, and there are many issues with the court system, which perhaps we can't go into today, but it's a challenging route for anyone to go through. But I think that's why we have been strongly supportive of the government's proposals for a compulsory redress scheme or schemes for private landlords. And as I said earlier, we are piloting a redress scheme for our members to identify how a redress scheme can work effectively for private landlords, recognising the large number of landlords that there are in the sector. Registering with the redress scheme would provide an opportunity for details of the properties let out by the landlord to be collated alongside the landlord's redress registration. So it's an opportunity to improve compliance by keeping records of the relevant documents that you've mentioned already, for example, the EPC rating, the electrical safety certificate, the gas safety certificate, and so on. And this can be linked with the unique property reference number to allow easy reference for both tenants and enforcement authorities as to whether the landlord is complying with the regulations that are set out. When prospective tenants then make initial inquiries about renting a property, they should be able to check with the redress scheme that their landlord meets the required standards.
So they can immediately see, perhaps somewhere online, that all of these documents are all collated together and available. Absolutely. In February, the Mayor announced that he was going to fund a new qualification and training package with the University of Middlesex to train local authority housing enforcement officers. So it would be able to train them up so that they've got this sort of tip-top private rented sector environmental health qualifications, so that they can, fully understand the HHSRA, which you were talking about earlier. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think having, that assistance? I mean, obviously, people talk a lot about bad apples and it being a small number, and I'm pretty sure it is a small number. But because there is so much private rented sector, that it means it can impact on so many different individuals. Do you think that would be helpful to have enhanced support from local authorities in that way?
Absolutely, yes. We're supportive of the Mayor's scheme, and we're supportive of higher resources in local authorities for environmental health officers. It's been mentioned already that the HHSRS model is complex. It's difficult for landlords to understand. It's difficult for tenants to understand. The government is reviewing HHSRS at the moment and looking at what can be done to make it more understandable for all parties who are involved in the sector. We are involved in that review alongside a number of other different organisations and local authorities that are working in the sector, and we want to see that improved so that there is much more transparency about what requirements there are for housing in the sector.
You're probably familiar with the right to repair scheme, which came in 1994. Obviously, it has quite serious limitations. Would you agree that expanding the scope of the scheme so that it covers the private rented sector would help tenants?
I'm afraid I'm not that familiar with the scheme, but I would say that there currently are protections for tenants from retaliatory evictions if a landlord is seeking to evict a tenant once they've made a complaint to the local authority. So there are protections in place for tenants to ensure that they are able to make complaints, legitimate complaints about their properties. And I think that we don't see that there's a high number of retaliatory evictions in the sector, but of course there should be none at all. So we support those protections for tenants.
Would you agree with getting rid of Section 21 altogether?
We're not campaigning to retain Section 21, and we're working with
Right, all our screens just went blank. And we probably should adjourn to try and establish whether or not we're still broadcasting, because if we're not, there's no point in having the committee. Yeah, so I'll just bang the gavel and we'll be back shortly if we're still here. Don't know if that works. And there goes the feedback from my laptop, which I didn't turn off first. Sorry.
Okay, from our perspective, we think we're good to go. Thank you for your patience.
Can I just check that we can hear the people on Zoom when they speak to us? Can one of them speak, please?
This is Lynn from Haringey.
That's all fine. Great. Okay. What am I doing? I will now bang the gavel and we will be back online. Okay. Okay, welcome back to the Housing Committee of the London Assembly. We have taken a short adjournment due to technical difficulties in our new building, but everything is all fixed now. And we were back. We're talking to representatives of different aspects of the private rented sectors, operation, private renters themselves, and the regulation. We have members from local authorities here. We are going to come soon to people from the GLA and the Mayor's team. And the next set of questions are briefly from Assemblymember Baker, and then we will move to questions about what the government is doing.
Thank you. My question's about tenancies, and initially I'd like to ask Meera and then come to Helen and Lynn. We've talked quite a lot about enforcement, but just wondering what the most effective measures might be for encouraging and enabling landlords to provide more secure tenancies and perhaps therefore better quality homes. Sorry, Meera. That was directed at you first. Apologies.
Tenancies on average are over 4 years long in England as a whole, and the vast majority of private renters have said that their last tenancy ended because they wanted to move. So over 3/4 ended the tenancy themselves because they wanted to move. Just 8% said that they were asked to leave by their landlord and letting agent, and these statistics are from the English Housing Survey. I think that there is obviously a lot of reform that is on the agenda from the government, which will change the nature of tenancies by removing Section 21. But I think there is often a perception that landlords are seeking to end tenancies at the end of, say, a fixed term of a year. But in fact, it's in landlords' interest to keep good tenants in their properties. And the government's most recent survey of private landlords in England showed that 70% of landlords had kept the rent the same at their most recent tenancy renewal, indicating that where landlords want to maintain the tenancy, they will seek to do so by making sure that they can keep those tenants who are in situ in the properties.
Okay, I'll come to Helen and Lynn in a moment, but I mean, the amount of time that people stay in private rented accommodation is significantly less than other forms of accommodation. So would you agree that is an issue, whether or not those are a result of people being forced out or not? It's just more insecure. Would you agree that's an issue, and are there measures that might encourage or enable landlords to change that?
I think it depends on whether it's the tenant's choice or not. If the tenant is choosing to move, then that's their choice, and that's the benefit of the private renters sector, that tenants have that ability to move. It has benefits economically and socially, so tenants can move to where their work is, or can move when their circumstances change.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I think that's so. Helen and Lynn, the same question. Do you think there are ways of encouraging longer tenancies in order to make the private rented sector more stable?
So I'll go first, Lynn, if that's okay. So I definitely agree if there is ways that we can incentivise that to happen. And it was interesting, you know, the experience of the Assembly members online about saying that she was letting to NHS workers, and and they were there, sort of staying there for a longer time because she was providing from the sounds of it, a very nice environment and a very safe environment. So as a consequence, it worked out well, and she was able to sustain that tenancy. I think that the difficulty you have in London is that if one resident moves out, if they're unhappy with their property because there's some disrepair and they complain to the landlord and the landlord says, well, move, you don't like it, there's always someone next in the queue who was there to go and to move it, because there is that lack of accommodation in London. So I think the picture in London is a bit different to what Meera has been explaining or advising when she's looking at general statistics from the English Housing Conditions Survey. So from my experience in London, what I would say I think there's a very good practice initiative that I've come across in temporary accommodation. So where the council has a duty to house and to homeless persons, where they've accepted that duty, there is a scheme which has been used. I think it originated in Southwark, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's something that's, I think, been taken on in Newham, where if a private rented landlord agrees for a family who may be on benefits to go and be housed, that they will get what's called an insurance-backed guarantee as part of paid up front by the local authority, in exchange for a longer tenancy, a minimum of a 12-month or a 1 or a 2-year tenancy agreement. And so the idea with that is that, because what landlords say to us is, particularly when it comes to those who are, who may be on the homeless register, that they're very reluctant to take those families because they're concerned that their rent won't be paid or that the property will be damaged. Mm-hmm. So this is an insurance-backed guarantee system, which means that they get, I think it's from recollection, it's £50,000 content insurance in case it all goes completely pear-shaped, and they get a minimum rent payment back as well. So those type of schemes I think would be interesting because, as Kate said, the reality is that when it comes to anybody who's on the homeless register in temporary accommodation, there isn't a social housing sector for them to fall back on. They have, the reality is the private rented sector is their avenue to go into to more sustainable longer-term housing. So I think that's a really good scheme that might actually help to encourage landlords to provide longer-term tenancies. And maybe there's some potential there of seeing how that could be potentially rolled out throughout the, maybe London as a special case, because we have that sort of desperate need for good quality rented accommodation.
Thank you. Lynn, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to say really that it probably crosses over with some of the stuff that we talked about earlier on, but with the PRS now being the market of choice for a lot of people who can't get on the own occupation ladder, that we might start seeing people wanting to have private rented accommodation as their home. And I don't think we look at it like that. Landlords, I think, don't see it as being somebody's home. And so that's why sometimes we get a bit of the exploitation that we tend to see with landlords feeling that they can just let themselves in, or that they don't have to invest and maintain because it's not seen as somebody's home in that same way. I also think that now that we're getting more families in the private rented sector, sustainable tenancies are really important, especially when children are settling into schools and we want people to have local workplaces. So I think we might start to see the need for those longer term tenancies. I also think the PRS there's a greater use of the PRS for all different types of tenants now, and I think I know from Haringey perspective, a lot of the issues that we have between tenant and landlord, where the relationship has fallen down, that we're kind of using our partnership arrangements. In Haringey, we've got something called Connected Communities, where we try and provide mediation between tenant and landlords to prevent any type of future eviction that may occur. And that could be because tenants have got alcohol, drug-related issues. We've got families who are extremely overcrowded, who are living with small children in flats with no facilities or outdoor spaces. And so, for other people living in that block, we get a lot of noise complaints, a lot of antisocial behaviour complaints, and then it's trying to kind of work with tenants and landlords to sustain those tenancies. So I think there probably is, a wider need for us to work with other partnerships within our local authorities or with the voluntary sector sometimes in order to to make sure that we do start to support landlords where the tenancy could be quite difficult from the tenant's perspective, but also then the landlord's got to deal with complaints that are coming in from other tenants or other residents, you know, alongside that. So I think it is something that I think we need to kind of take on board, really, that it is a lot harder now in terms of the different types of people that are using the PRS.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Kate, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, and obviously be quick because I know we're running over, but I do just think we have to move the conversation on from talking about enabling and incentivising. You know, Meera's right that it is in landlords' interest to have longer-term tenants. That hasn't resulted in longer-term tenancies. We're several years on now from the government acknowledging that the current tenancy legislation isn't fit for purpose and they need to introduce longer-term tenancies. So I do think we have to be talking about why is the government not moving faster on that legislation, enabling 10 years ago.
And Chair, can I just ask Claire on tenancies, just to get the tenant's point of view, and particularly no one's sort of mentioned, although you may be hinting towards it, more assured or regulated tenancies, and just wondering whether that's something that generally you'd support.
It is, yeah. Yeah, like abolishing Section 21, longer and secure tenancies is definitely, you know, something that London Renters Union members want to see. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. A very quick question from Assemblymember Webb.
So I've just reinserted myself into the agenda. So this is a question for the NRLA, and it's something to think about, which is that the current AST process that we have, what is it that is stopping the NRLA to promote 2 to 5 year ASTs to your members? If you've got 95,000 members, then they could be offering 3-year ASTs, and perhaps we wouldn't have that long conversation about enabling, because that doesn't require a change in the law. And it has been mooted by predecessor organisations, was the reason I thought of it just now.
I think the challenge with longer tenancies is that landlords, longer AST fixed term tenancies, is that landlords don't have confidence in the court system as it currently exists to enable them to regain possession when there has been a fault of the tenant. So, for example, if there has been severe rent arrears, if there's antisocial behaviour, or if there's damage to the property. Because of that, landlords often rely on Section 21 because they have more confidence that they will be able to regain possession of the property, even if they do have grounds that they could use the Section 8 fault-based process to regain possession.
So just to be clear, so I'm not suggesting that you remove a landlord's ability to take back their property. What I'm suggesting is, rather than offering a 1 year and re-sign every year, just have within that a break clause, which maybe is enacted after a couple of years. You can still have all of those levers. What I'm not suggesting here, a Section 8, although that is ideally we just get rid of Section 21. But in the meantime, while we wait for Michael Gove to do what he's doing, to make that happen, that to my mind, that doesn't really, it's not beyond the NRLA to do that and offer that to their members.
Break clauses are legally questionable. We wouldn't advise our members to use break clauses in their tenancies. And you can't use a Section 21 during the fixed term of a tenancy. So the issue is really about addressing the possession grounds, addressing the process in the courts, and addressing the time and cost of seeking possession when you have legitimate reasons to do so. We do also support the use of more mediation and the introduction of a conciliation service for landlords and tenants to be able to address issues without having to go through the courts. We've been participating in a pilot with TDS on mediation for landlords and tenants, and we've put out proposals for an ACAS-style system of conciliation to enable landlords and tenants to reach agreement where there is a dispute. But I think as things currently stand, it wouldn't be, we wouldn't be able to support longer term tenancies unless there are changes to the possession process and to the court system that give landlords that confidence, because landlords need to have that confidence in order to be able to invest in the sector.
But just back to that point, just really quick, sorry, Sean, the suggestion is not, obviously there would be a reform if there is a scrapping of Section 21. In the intervening period, landlords will continue to be able to take back their properties after a fixed term, and we're talking about the people and the tenancies, it just seems like we're assuming that everybody who's a private tenant is a bit of a bandit and is going to destroy a house. What I'm suggesting is for those people who need longer tenancies, like people with families or older people, that they're able to have a security for 2 years rather than 6 months plus 6 months. That's all. It doesn't need you to. Landlords will still be able to take back their properties, but it sounds like you're opposed to that.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that landlords need to have confidence that they can take possession of their properties when they have legitimate reasons to do so. If they are providing a 2 or 3 year fixed term, they don't have that confidence at the moment, and that's why they provide shorter fixed terms and either allow those tenancies to roll onto periodic tenancies, or they provide a new fixed term to their tenant, and that's for landlords and tenants to discuss between themselves which preference they have. But if you are calling for 2 to 3 year fixed terms under the current system, that won't have that landlords don't have the same ability to regain possession under under a fixed term as they do at the end of a fixed term. And so those changes need to be seen in the possession process before we could support that.
Okay, members and guests, we've completed section 1 of 4 sections of questions that we wish to ask in the course of a 2-hour meeting. Now, notwithstanding the break that we had for technical difficulties, we are now nearly an hour and a half into the original meeting time. So we definitely need to speed up, particularly, I think, the answers to the questions. If you can be as brief as you possibly can, that would be absolutely great. If you have further information to give, or there are documents or proposals, we're more than keen to get them, because we are on an evidence gathering mission today. But we do need to reach, first of all, questions about what the government is doing, because we have waited some time for the Renters Reform Bill white paper, and we have some clues now. And Assemblymember Devenish will take over the chair from me in a moment and ask those questions. And we definitely need to reach asking the Mayor's team what they're working on as well, which is the third section. We may not reach section 4 at all at this rate, but I'm going to do my best. So just handing over the chair now to Assemblymember Devenish, who is the Deputy Chair currently, and for some questions on government work.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very, very brief. Please give us brief answers. This first question is to Helen and Lynn. What could be the impact of the proposals set out in the Levelling Up white paper? Helen.
Sorry. So I think the review of the Decent Home Standard and consult on a legally binding Decent Home Standard, the PRS, I think we've had previous conversations around this about the importance that it needs to be intuitive, straightforward. The previous Decent Home Standards talks about not being a cold home, being free of meeting a certain decent homes disrepair, having a bathroom and a kitchen, which is not so odd. I think it's 20 years for a kitchen, 30 years for a bathroom. So I think it needs to be fairly straightforward so that landlords understand it, officers, enforcement officers understand it, and also critically that tenants understand it. So I think that's really important. The other area is the National Landlord Register. I said our experience of doing the licensing register we have over 40,000 properties in Newham currently registered, and also recently we've been dealing with the cladding register for the government, the Delta Register, and that's quite interesting. But it's probably on a similar parallel of what maybe has been anticipated might be on a National Landlord Register in terms of knowing who your landlord is and getting those details. And I think the experience in that is actually it's incredibly complicated to try and find out who actually owns a property. If you've overseas landlords, will they be on that register? If you're going to have, we talk about who the superior owner is in terms of rent-to-rent cases that are going on. And so there's lots of questions there, I think, and information I think that can be learned from not just the Delta Register for cladding, but also from the large-scale property licensing schemes. So coming to places such as Haringey or Newham and asking us about our experience of setting this up. And also I think the other critical issue for me is who's actually going to run the register. If it's local authority, you have to have it properly resourced. If it's not properly resourced, the register will fall apart. And as in the case in Scotland, there's been very, very little enforcement being done regards to that particular register at the moment. So I think learning from the other schemes as well.
Thank you. Lynn?
Yeah, so really just around decent homes, to echo what Helen said, I think it's really important that we align maybe some of the existing legislative requirements so that if the decent home standard is brought in, that it's, you know, that it's all collectively in one place. We know that have to produce gas and electrical safety certificates, EPCs to, you know, up to G. So I think having that sort of more refined list of sort of compliance that we expect a landlord to achieve, rather than having lots of bits all over the show and having it in one place, would be a really good way of covering all of that. And in terms of the register, completely agree again with Helen. It's about how non-compliance will be resourced and where that will fall, I suppose, in terms of making sure that local authorities have still got enforcement officers funded to be able to take up any non-compliance if that is what's going to be expected. But I do think it's a very good idea having the national register, especially around data and intelligence.
Thank you. That was my next question, actually. How will a proposed national landlord register interact with the existing borough licensing schemes and the London Rogue Landlord Checker? And I'm going to ask Helen and Lynn, but as you've already spoken, I'll start with Kate and Vicky. And please don't repeat things because of time. Thank you.
I think there are clear parallels between the two proposed schemes. Obviously, the Rogue Landlord and Agent Checker is well developed and well used in London, and used both by renters and by local authorities to check information and to share that, particularly for boroughs. I think they're designed to do different things, and so we would want to see some read across. But actually, I think the proposal for the National Landlord Register is that it should be light touch and mandatory, and actually we can talk about just collecting names and addresses, but as Helen said, that is quite a task in itself. And actually, if we had a set of names, contact addresses, property addresses, then that would take huge amounts of work away from enforcement officers and free them up to do some of that enforcement work, rather than spending days trying to track down individual landlords.
I'd say the same.
Excellent. Well, I was very short and to the point. I will move on to Ellie to take over.
Thank you. I have a question. So there are, obviously I have a question. The government's bringing forward proposals to reset the relationship between landlords and tenants in the social housing sector. So I don't want to ask your views about that, but are there any lessons from the proposals they have there that could be carried across to the private rented sector? That makes sense? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Helen and Lynn. Lynn?
I'm just trying to think.
If that's not something that you've prepared for, I'm sure we'd be happy to move on and take any views after the meeting, if you have any.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't.
That's totally fine.
I think the only thing is maybe on about cold homes.
Yeah.
About cold homes and dealing with that. That is a massive issue at the moment because of retrofitting. We've currently got some grants going on. We're pepper potting, sort of targeting individual properties. If we're going to make a difference and contribute to the whole decarbonisation agenda, we have to be doing enveloping of streets and integrating planning conditions and together. So there's probably some learning there. I think some of the local areas are better at dealing with some of the colder homes, I think, than the private rented sector. So that's just off the top of my head.
Totally fine. That's fine. If there is anything that comes across after the meeting, then please do pass it on to us.
Sam, next, number 9.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, so my question is for Vicky and Kate, and it's just to get an update on how a London-specific rent control and the London Private Rent Commission would work. Just really good to expand on that.
Thanks. Well, as you know, the Mayor has a set of proposals around introducing rent control in London, and a key part of that is to set up a London Rents Commission, which would do that work in terms of working out what would be the most appropriate system for London, bearing in mind that this has been rolled out in various other countries, and we can't just pick things up from one city in another country to ours. The Mayor has... the Mayor doesn't have any powers to do this himself, so he is dependent on government giving him the powers to do so. And that would need to involve a wide range of private rented stakeholders in a commission, including renters, thinking about issues such as how rents could be stabilised and then brought down over time, and importantly, how investment in existing and new private rented sector housing could be maintained. There are some of the issues that we've seen elsewhere where rent control systems have been implemented.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to recognise that we really do need government to fire the starting gun on this. The Mayor has recently reiterated his call for a 2-year rent freeze, recognising that we are really heading into a very, very severe cost of living crisis, and we are seeing rising demand for rented properties in London again, which is spiking rents. So in the short term, I think the onus is really on government to give that kind of emergency respite, and then in the longer term, devolve the powers to introduce rent control in London. But I think as well, we wouldn't want that conversation about devolution to be limited to just rent control. You know, we've heard repeatedly this morning that the PRS in London is just more challenging due to the size of it and due to that really imbalance of supply and demand. So actually, if we're talking levelling up, if we're talking what the government can do to support London, then looking more broadly at devolving the powers to regulate and improve standards should also be part of the conversation.
And this is partly for my benefit. Would the Commission also look at things like length of tenancies? So making sure that people can stay put for as long as they want to?
No, but there is separate work going on through the Mayor's London model that addresses tenancy length and provides, well, lots of recommendations that look very similar to some of the ones that the government is talking about introducing.
Okay. And is that something that you could offer to landlords and, you know, the members of the NRLA to think about implementing?
Well, I was interested by the conversation around longer fixed-term tenancies because although much of the conversation is about, you know, renters being able to stay in their properties for longer fixed-term tenancies might not be the way to do that. In that, actually, one of the things that's really important about the sector is the flexibility, and renters might well move for all sorts of reasons. Meera set out some about reasons why renters might choose to move. And so the Mayor's proposals are very much around open-ended tenancies, and they're the conversations that we're having with government, by which landlords have the ability to regain their properties where they have a legitimate reason to do so, kind of an expanded kind of set of possession grounds, but that renters can also have much more power in that relationship in terms of how long they stay.
Deputy Chair, may I resume chairing the meeting now? Thank you very much. Thank you for holding the fort. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, for moving quickly through a few questions there. I'm now handing over to Assemblymember Bailey for some further questions.
Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my question to Kate and Vicky about the rogue landlord checker, can I just go back to this question of rent controls? Given the fact that the Mayor hasn't set out how it would work, when it would work, what kind of rent controls he'd like to have, how realistic is it to ask the government to give him any powers? Because any reasonable government could not give a regional mayor powers if he hasn't explained what he would do with those powers.
I think we've seen that that's not how devolution has tended to work when the government has devolved powers to mayoral authorities. They do tend to look at the broad objectives, give the broad enabling powers, and then enable the specific detail to be worked through. And indeed, that's common with primary legislation. You know, we don't normally put through Parliament every detail. We allow that some of it will need to be worked out via secondary regulations. So I don't think it is unreasonable. I think what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the government's resistance is a question of perspective. You know, the government are coming from a national perspective where they are looking at what the English Housing Survey tells them nationally. They are looking at private rented markets in diverse places where often there's very low demand, very affordable rents. And what you see within London is that real focusing of minds that comes from the fact that you have boroughs like Newham where you have more than 50% of the population renting. You have the very high number of complaints that we've heard about this morning. You have exceptionally high rental costs, and that focuses minds within London politics and certainly reinforce when you poll Londoners on this, you know, 68% want rent control. That gives a focus to a London mayor, which I think isn't perhaps heard within national government, and I would suggest that that is a bigger reason why they've not been forthcoming with the devolved powers. But I don't know, Vicky, if you've got anything to add.
The only thing I would add is that it's a particular ask around devolving powers to set up a commission, and so that would be the first step for sure. And then, kind of in terms of what the commission designs and plans to implement, then that would be a second ask.
But let's be clear, this is a very fundamental thing. So you made the comment that the devolution has looked a particular way around, but this is a very fundamental change that, of course, other parts of the country would probably want to mirror. There is absolutely no framework given to the government. The government wouldn't know what they're giving to the mayor to do because he provided absolutely no details. You yourself have said about the significant challenges that rent controls have posed to other cities in the world, which are comparable. I get it, you can't compare London to Newcastle or Newquay. I understand that, but you could arguably compare it to places like New York or Stockholm, etc. You've provided no details around them. So just how successful do you think the mayor is going to be in receiving these powers when he has been able to provide absolutely no details to an environment that you yourself have said is very complicated and challenging?
There is a set of asks within the rent control ask of government in terms of devolution. We've talked about establishing a register of landlords, and that was right up there in terms of one of the things that the Commission would seek to do, primarily in order to understand how rents are paid across London in different boroughs, but also specifically to reduce rents and keep them more affordable, to incentivise continued investment, and, as Kate referred to implement interim measures that would alleviate what now look like even more pressing pressures on Londoners. So there is some detail within the Mayor's proposals that the government could work with if they chose to.
I'm going to have to move on, but those details, you know, they don't answer the fundamental questions about rent control and the impact it would have, because there's no denying it would have some impact. All Londoners, I've rented in London for many years, would like to see rent go in the opposite direction to where it generally has. But I think the Mayor's ask is unrealistic until he can answer the more fundamental questions about what it will do to investment in London, what it will do to supply in London, because ultimately no amount of rent controls can get around the economics of if there's very low supply, there's very high prices. And that's, I think, the questions that need to be answered before the government could jump on board.
Assembly Member Bailey, before you move on, I think you'll find Meera had her hand up.
Oh, excuse me.
And I don't know whether you noticed that.
I didn't. I'm sorry, we were sort of locked in.
And I would like to ask a point of clarification before you move on as well, just on something that Vicky just said. But start with Meera, if that's okay. She had her hand up.
Please, Meera, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to this conversation that according to the Office for National Statistics, private sector rents across London increased by just 0.1% in the year to January 2022, which was by far the lowest increase anywhere in the country. Over this period, inflation, as measured by the CPIH, was 4.9%. Since the current mayor was elected in April 2016, private sector rents across London have continually been falling in real terms when compared against both the RPI and the CPIH. Compared to the RPI, private sector rents fell by 17.8% between April 2016 and January 2022, and compared to the CPIH, they fell by 10.2% between the same period. Also, on the supply issue, we recently commissioned some research by Capital Economics, which indicated that there is a supply crisis in London. If rates of new owner occupation and social housing continue at their 10-year average, there will need to be 80,000 new PRS dwellings needed per year in London to meet the housing need. That's 4 times the average that has been over the past decade. And government figures show that the stock of PRS housing in London has fallen by 85,000 over the past 5 years. So, as you were saying, there are some complex issues here which need to be addressed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Chair?
Yeah, just a point of clarification, because I think you were pressing Vicky there on whether or not the Mayor's proposals currently were detailed enough. And what you said, Vicky, was you said our first ask is for the powers to set up a commission, then you'd look at the details, and then you'd make further asks. Now, that isn't what I understood before. I think the Mayor has, in his most recent press release, his most recent pre-election press release about rent controls, he says, I'm calling on ministers to give me the powers to stop rents rising, which seems to me like it's a it's a one-shot ask to the government for the powers to control rents, which he will do via commission. Is that not right?
That's right. Yeah.
So the commission would come up with the detail later, but the powers to control rents would come with the powers. We don't need the powers to set up a commission, do we?
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah. I did catch that.
Yeah. So that's right, isn't it? I'm just clarifying because, yeah, we wouldn't want to have to campaign again.
Yeah. and can you see the problem? That feels like you're putting the cart before the horse. Surely you need the commission to provide detail before the government changed the law and gave the power. And that's where Londoners' confusion lies. But I digress.
I think, yeah, we're all getting to the same point. Yeah, there's no power needed to do the work that the commission is proposed to be doing, I don't think.
Exactly that, yes. But... No, listen, that's not the point. I just want to get to it. We can have that political argument another day. Just want to get detail. But look, let me ask you about the rogue landlord checker. Is it working, Kate or Vicky?
Just finding the numbers to show you how well it is working. Yes, the Rogue Landlord and Agent Checker is working in London. In contrast, in some ways, to the national Rogue Landlords database that the government has introduced. I'm just, sorry, looking for my numbers. There it is. Here, sorry. Right, so we've got three checkers, as you know. We've got the Rogue Landlords and Agent Checker, by which renters can check the details of their landlords either before they move into a property or when they are in there to see what their record is. It was launched in 2017 and so far over 2,500 cases have been uploaded by local authorities to the checker, and the website's received over 350,000 unique page views. One of the key things that the Rogue Landlord and Agent Checker does is enable boroughs to cross-reference landlords and share intelligence, because we know that landlords don't operate just within borough boundaries, and so that enables them to share information and to do more shared enforcement work. So yes, I would say that the Rogue Landlords and Agent Checker is working. To that, we've added the Property Licence Checker, which enables renters and actually landlords use it to check whether their property should have a licence, and then enables them to check with the borough as to whether it does, which again leads to increased enforcement action. And the third of those tools is the Report a Rogue tool, which is my favourite, whereby renters or any member of the public can report a problem with a private rented property. And that just gets directed directly to the private rented sector team in the right borough, so that renters predominantly, but any member of the public doesn't need to try and work their way through a council website to understand kind of how to report a problem. And from that, we're seeing significant improvements.
So you would say it is working, but then others would say, so why are so few people checking the website, and what are you doing to encourage more people to do so? Because on one hand, the facility sounds great, and we all know, particularly if you're renting, you're trying to make ends meet, navigating huge bits of paperwork and websites is nonsense. A one-stop shop to find these places is useful, but there is a feeling amongst some that there aren't enough people using this facility. What are you doing to promote the facility itself?
Well, as I mentioned, over 350,000, the website's received over 350,000 unique page views, and we're continuing to build on that. So we work with boroughs, we work with lots of stakeholder organisations, including Shelter and Citizens Advice, to make sure that there are links to the checker on their websites. And that's a really important way of getting to renters that we might not see otherwise. We work really closely with our borough colleagues to help them share that information too.
How many renters are there in London, roughly?
2.4 million.
So you can see how 350 over a 5-year period doesn't seem like that many, but of course not everybody would need to complain. Yeah. So I just try to give people who are listening some sense of scale. Is it right that the public view of the checker only holds details on prosecutions and fines until the conviction is spent, which is usually a 12-month period, but the version for enforcement agencies holds those details for 10 years?
Yes, I think it is.
Fair enough. No,
we've received considerable legal advice while we were setting up the checker to make sure that it was compliant. The 10-year bit for on tier 2 for the second tier, which is the bit that boroughs where boroughs share information, is designed specifically so that those cases that are take longer to build, where a pattern of behaviour might become apparent from a landlord over a number of years or across boroughs, is to make sure that that's captured, and so that boroughs can share information and make moves towards things like banning orders and rent repayment orders, and have that knowledge to hand.
That seems to make sense. What improvements can be made to the checker whilst the government proposals on the private rented sector are implemented?
Well, we're continuing to seek to consult with boroughs. We meet with them. We have a PRS partnership that meets every 2 months, which all the London boroughs are members of, and their PRS leads are part of that. And that's a key way that we keep up to date with what's useful to boroughs and make sure that it really works. So we're continuing to have those conversations. We've got some development time planned in, hopefully, for this new financial year, and we'll be very happy to report back to the Assembly about kind of what additional things we can do with the checker.
Okay, I'm going to go straight to 12A, Chair, for the...
The question 11 does need to go to the local authorities and to the Renters' Union.
Say again?
The question you just asked. We do need to get the opinions of the local authorities and the renters on that.
So I'll ask the question again, and I'll direct it to Helen to start with, okay? What improvements can be made to the checker whilst the government proposals for the public rented sector are being implemented?
I think generally, I think the rogue landlord checker has been very well received, and it's a really good tool to share intelligence across local authorities, because if there's a rogue landlord operating in one borough, the chances are they may be operating in your neighbouring borough as well. So, and as we talked about the partnership meetings that Vicky mentioned, where we can actually have those conversations, and and I think that has really improved since the rogue landlord checker has been in place. So I think if I'm being critical of it, the only thing I think in terms, and I'm sure this will come out in further, is maybe a bit more detail could be provided on that particular. It could be expanded to provide a bit more information.
Meera? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Go ahead, Meera.
Sorry. We checked on the 18th of March, and 23 local authorities in London had not listed any landlords on the checker. So the effectiveness of the checker is only as good as the enforcement of the regulations. So we would encourage there to be more consistent enforcement across London and more consistent use of the checker. And we would also call for an annual report to be published on the performance of the checker.
Okay, thank you. Lynn?
Yeah, so we personally find the checker extremely useful. We're quite a little bit behind at Haringey at the moment in terms of our issuing and use of civil penalty notices. So it's been really good for us in terms of training and just for staff to use benchmarking in terms of the types of fines that local authorities are setting for different offences in order to, maintain consistency. And again, as Helen said, just in terms of looking at the historical background as to whether a landlord is known in another local authority or has committed offences. Again, you can take that into account when you're setting your civil penalty notice fine. So it's been really, really good use of that. And also just to identify other local authorities who may have a similar landlord and to be able to connect with those local authorities to find out what officers know about the landlord and how they've taken things forward. So we have found it invaluable, and I do attend the GLA meetings and contribute to, the upkeep of the checker. And my staff are going on regular training, so that when we get new staff, they know how to navigate it and how to utilise it. So we found it really beneficial.
Thank you. It sounds like the checker is going down a treat. I just hope more and more people use the checker. Look, let me quickly move on to...
Can we get Claire? Sorry.
Oh, my God. Sorry, Claire.
Thanks. Just to be brief, I think I would echo that there needs to be more funding for enforcement, and there needs to be more enforcement so that there can be more rogue landlord offences which are being registered and put up onto the checker. I would echo that.
Okay, here we go. Question 12 at last. What else could the Mayor do with his powers to improve the private rented sector? And I'll roll another question into that as well. And does the Mayor need additional powers to help the private rented sector? What difference would additional powers make? What ones would you ask for? What else could the Mayor do now?
Well, two of the things we've already touched on, I think, they're the key things. So one we've touched on again about rent control. The second is very much about, and in terms of devolution, the Mayor would like to have the powers to make decisions about selective licensing schemes in London. We've heard earlier about how useful selective licensing schemes can be, but they are beset by problems such as kind of a real lack of consistency, which is particularly a thing for London, because landlords and renters may have experience of renting or letting properties in different parts of London. And so that would be a key way to make sure that there is more consistency, and also to make sure that there is a more proactive kind of and positive approach to licensing. Boroughs are keen to introduce I'm not going to use the word additional because that would get really confusing, but more selective licensing schemes. And that would be a real way for the Mayor to add his weight to improving conditions and standards, which then leads to increased work around enforcement in London.
Helen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to echo that point. I think it's a really important point and something that Newham would fully support. Having had a selective licensing scheme since 2013, we're going through a consultation process currently for looking at new future designations of our selective licensing scheme from 2023 onwards. It is a huge project. There is a government circular which has got some very, very specific criteria that needs to be complied with. Statutory consultation, a huge cost to local authority, and where we've got established schemes that isn't a light touch version of continuing that, you have to go through the whole process again. I mean, this is the current project we're working on with the project team since for over a year, and we could be using those resources in a much more positive way towards improving, our resources towards improving private rented sector rather than going through this. So we have to, for discretionary, it has to go through our council committee for approval, and then if that's approved, it then has to go to the Department for Levelling Up for them to actually look at it again, and that's other application process and can take months and months and months. And if that could be devolved back, that power was taken away, and I think it was 2015, 2016, to the Department for Levelling Up or its equivalents beforehand, if that could go back to the Mayor of London so they could actually be able to make that call, because they know the areas far better and know what the current issues. And as we said, London's got a particular set of problems, private rented, which seems to be different to how Meera is describing from the general sort of private rent sector issues throughout the whole of the country.
I'd love to delve a bit deeper, but time is running out. Meera, can I just ask you the same question, and also, do you worry that any of these changes will drive cost? Will landlords just be passing on the cost to renters?
In terms of what the Mayor can do, we would recommend that the Mayor spends less time calling for things he can't deliver. The government isn't going to allow, like the power to introduce rent controls, and more time working in collaboration with local authorities, landlord organisations and tenant organisations to identify and remove criminal landlords from the sector, and improve enforcement in the sector across London. In terms of the changes and the cost for landlords, I think the bigger concern is that the changes that the government is proposing don't actually provide landlords with the confidence to continue to invest in the market. So I spoke earlier about the concerns that landlords have about the possession process. If Section 21 is removed and there aren't changes to the possession process alongside that provide landlords with that confidence, then you will see landlords choosing to leave the market or choosing to be even more, take even more references and care over choosing their tenants so that they can minimise their risks. So there needs to be a workable solution with all of these reforms that allow landlords to continue to invest and also provide them with that confidence that they will be able to regain possession if they need to, and that they don't have to take extra precautions to minimise the risk to their businesses.
Thank you. Does anybody else like to make a contribution, or go for it, Claire?
So we would say, yeah, the Mayor needs to be doing absolutely everything that he can possibly be doing to introduce rent controls. The cost of living crisis is not even going to be about choosing between heating or eating. For some people, it's going to be like paying the rent and not getting either, and it's completely unacceptable. And yeah, local and national government need to be doing everything they can to do something about that, and rent controls should be part of that. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of our members live in temporary accommodation. So if you live in temporary accommodation, you've been accepted by your local council as being in housing need, but you're placed in the private rented sector. You have a landlord, you have a letting agent who manages and owns the place that you live in. So in reality, these people are a form of private renters, but with even less rights and protections and lower standards. What we have found is that when we talk to councils about conditions in temporary accommodation, we've heard sometimes a reluctance for councils to hold companies like ZFA and Landslide accountable, who we have many cases of providing poor quality temporary accommodation. And they kind of fear in a way that if they cut the contract with that company or they try and hold that company to account, they're going to end up in an even worse position, because they're going to have an even greater shortage of temporary accommodation in Borough, and keeping people close to schools and their communities is really important. And it needs London-wide action. It doesn't make sense. We've heard, for example, that West London councils will place their residents in East London boroughs because it's cheaper. It doesn't make sense. There needs to be a London-wide, city-wide approach to this issue. It's tearing communities apart, and working class communities, communities who are like primarily comprised of people of colour, people that have migrated to this country, are the most affected by this. And yeah, is there a role that the GLA can play in kind of doing something about temporary accommodation standards and enforcement in a city-wide way? Because it doesn't work borough by borough, we think.
Do you want us to come back on that or move on?
You should come back on that.
Yeah, really briefly. Just to say that the Mayor is funding a project called Setting the Standard, which does exactly that with boroughs, which means that inspectors go in and check the quality of that TA accommodation. It's growing. It started from a small base, but it is growing, and it's clear evidence that the Mayor's recognised that is absolutely a problem across London.
And on a similar note, we also provided funding to set up a similar service called Capital Letters, which was trying to address that perversity it can sometimes feel like you have of someone from a West London borough being placed east and vice versa. So Capital Letters is trying to provide a clearinghouse to sort of avoid that. It's working well, but I think we wouldn't deny it's had limited impact so far. I think we are very conscious that, as you rightly say, the challenge of temporary accommodation comes from the statutory duty that is on local authorities. So our general ethos is we very much want to work with local authorities, and where they tell us across London input can be useful, we really want to kind of step in where we can. But we do want to recognise that it's local authorities who ultimately feel this legal duty over them and have the responsibility to tenants. So, as I say, where they tell us we can be helpful, we want to be helpful. But we don't want to muddy the waters with the fact that the legal responsibility does sit with local authorities.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's back to you.
Yeah, I just thank you. That was a really interesting discussion, particularly around licensing, and what you raised, Claire, was I think really important there. I hear you, Kate, saying you'd like the Mayor to step in on the temporary accommodation standards issue where it's appropriate, and I saw Helen nodding, and I wonder, is there a bit of a conflict that councils face in that if they do take action against larger temporary accommodation providers, they then are stuck with where to put homeless families. So the intervention of the Mayor from above, as it were, is then therefore useful. Is that something you agree with?
I think it's an interesting conundrum that I think local authorities are sort of tackling and trying to balance every day. So where Newham is part of the WREN standards, which is a combined standards with Waltham Forest, Enfield, Redbridge and Newham, to try and set some standards out. And this is mainly for we're talking about the nightly let accommodation, which is where a lot of homeless families end up. And as Claire said, they're not just there for months because there's nowhere to move on to in the social housing sector. Their only solution is finding more secure tenancy in the private renter sector, which is there's lots of reluctance from landlords to do so. So they tend to be stuck in this nightly let accommodation for years and years. It can be very poor standards. The difficulty you have with the WREN standards is that in terms of there isn't that much legal powers, enforcement powers that local authorities can thrust upon those landlords who don't do the repairs they're meant to do. And there's a big resource for them to go and inspect the properties as well, which is when the burden falls back onto the local authority to do so. So one of the things we've been looking at as a WREN group is actually looking at the legal advice around potentially licensing, because all those, our WREN group have large-scale licensing schemes in place. So, and actually the legal advice is that we can actually license them. So we've just started to license nightly let accommodation. So we're working with the big providers at the moment. Waltham Forest are doing it, Enfield have done it, and Redbridge and Newham are now following through to actually try and bring in our enforcement capability for those where they fall short of the standards expected. So, but it's a balancing act because, as you said, if a local authority decides that property A in their borough is not up to their standards and they withdraw the family, they then have that duty to rehouse that family somewhere else, temporary accommodation. And then in the meantime, maybe someone from Westminster who then will house one of their homeless families in that property because there's such a desperate need for it. So there's a real battle between the external local authorities and the internal local trying to find that accommodation. So, yeah, I think I welcome what Kate has said about the other scheme setting the standards, which is focusing more on the sort of the bedsit type accommodation, the smaller bedsit units, rather than the whole house nightly let accommodation properties. Yeah. So, yeah, that started small and it's growing. So,
that's really interesting, and we'd love to find out more about that, actually. I completely recognise that conundrum, actually. I mean, you would think that the local authorities being essentially commissioning this accommodation would be able to stay on top of standards without even requiring licensing. But this fact that there's the cross-borough issue definitely seems to mean that the Mayor needs to get involved, because like you say, if you don't rent it, someone else will, and there's still a homeless family in that poor quality accommodation. Sorry, Kate, do you want to say something?
Yeah, because I think commissioning is kind of the key here, because what none of us have talked about so far today is housing benefit. And we know the low levels of housing benefit available have all sorts of perverse outcomes across the private rented sector, but particularly in temporary accommodation, the level of housing benefit that councils can claim hasn't gone up for 11 years now. So, yes, we might want to think of local authorities as sort of powerful commissioning agents, but effectively their buying power has been severely curtailed because of housing benefit. And the answer to that is financial support that it's, for government to provide, not the mayor. But they are sort of over a barrel at the moment because there are so few landlords operating within that very, very constrained point in the market.
Yeah, I mean, it parallels the problems that renters themselves have in lots of ways, doesn't it, in terms of being able to have any power in the system. Right, we do need to move on. Members, I'm not going to ask my next question, so that helps. And we're moving straight to Leonie Cooper's next set of questions, if that's possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. And hopefully we'll won't have any problems with the broadcast this time. We'll just be able to keep going. So it all seemed to fall apart after I'd been speaking before. I just wanted to ask Helen and Lynn, we've just been talking there about the government and the mayor. What more could the government do to support local authorities in driving up standards? And perhaps if I start with Helen and then come on to Lynn.
Microphone's still on. So what more could the government do to drive up standards? So I think...
support local authorities. Yeah, what could the government do? Yeah.
So I think we've got some new government guidance coming in about HHSRS, which will be really helpful, and hopefully it will make it a bit more intuitive across the board. So that would be good. I think what I've mentioned about the discretionary power for large-scale licensing schemes, to try and make that process a lot easier for local authorities to bring in, because there's a huge resource implication for any local authority considering it, particularly when there's such a squeeze on council budgets. I think that would be really helpful. I think so I think that clarity about the decent home standards would be good. I think the National Landlord Register, the selective licensing runs in parallel with the National Landlord Register, because selective licensing is very much targeted where it's particularly needed, where you have issues about ASB, poor property conditions, etc. We may not have that throughout the whole country, but so you can target it through those schemes, and London would benefit from that, I think. So I think that's probably... Shall I move on to Lynn? Because I'm just conscious I've been talking quite a lot, and Lynn hasn't had that much opportunity.
Sure. Lynn, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that? What more could the government do to support local authorities in driving up standards in the PRS?
Yeah, so I think certainly around the licensing schemes, it is a tool within the Housing Act that encourages local authorities to use it. But I think I'm in my third year now of trying to bring in selective licensing. We're about to submit our submission to DLUC, and it's taken a lot of resources. It's a lot of upfront cost for local authorities. There is limited assistance and guidance, I think, for local authority officers. We try to be specialists, but we're not specialists in everything, and we're kind of relying on our other local authority partners quite often, where they've brought schemes in to kind of learn from that. Some sort of good practice guide or more of an input from the ministry officers in terms of supporting applications, I think would be of great help, because it is a huge investment, and to get a negative decision after 3 years of work, from a morale perspective, if that happens to us at Haringey, we'll have to pick ourselves up and think about how we're going to deliver in the private rented sector without selective licensing, funding a team of private rented sector officers, on a very low base budget essentially for revenue costs. And also we know that there is a shortage of environmental health officers, which again, I think a massive recruitment campaign is required. I think that's more a local, a mayoral level, to be fair, to try and encourage college leavers to take up this particular sector, which I think a lot of young people are not aware of, and obviously ties into lots of other threads throughout public health and improving well-being and healthy lives. Is if you've got poor property conditions, there is a knock-on effect. So yeah, and also just maybe accepting that private rented sector, the issues with the private rented sector go beyond just a local authority's private rented sector team. You know, there's an awful lot of strands now that need to come in, and I know selective licensing guidance, you know, feels on this sort of coordinated approach, but I'm not too sure when we're talking about the private rented sector that we make sure that we've always got the right people around the table. It goes beyond just a private rented sector team, and I think a bit like teaching profession, officers now feel like they're social workers, safeguarders, planning enforcement officers, you know, housing, homelessness specialists, tenancy specialists, because we're sometimes the first person to go in there. You know, it's now a bigger role than it ever used to be.
Thank you. I mean, that's very interesting. And you touched on in your remarks there what you one thing that you thought the mayor could do. And I guess the same question generally then about what more the mayor could do to support local authorities in driving up standards in the private rented sector. One thing, as I mentioned earlier, is this scheme launched in February for skilling up people to become environmental health officers. From what you just said, I assume that is something that you would support to help attract more people in general, but also getting people skilled up so that they can inspect in the private rented sector. Are there other things that you feel that the mayor could be doing to support councils in London?
Yeah, I think, you know, we're looking at apprenticeship schemes in Haringey. We don't pay as well as some of our London borough neighbours. So actually it's become a very competitive market in terms of who pays more, people, you know, the turnover of staff when those job adverts comes out. So it's looking at ways that we can keep people in the profession, but also wanting people to take up the profession. I think the use of the apprenticeships and those specific PRS courses, especially when we're talking about looking at enforcement, because you know, it's that aspect of getting somebody to the point in their training where they can stand in front of the first tier tribunal and, you know, present evidence and be challenged and to understand the legislation. You know, it's getting that person to that point, which I think, we're struggling with. So yeah, and I know that, you know, as a private rented sector group with the GLA, we're talking about this all the time. So, you know, we're feeding into that sort of growing, that forward plan of need, I think, you know, as things arise, you know, we are feeding into that.
Thanks, Lynn. Can I just ask Helen the same question then? You know, what else could the Mayor be doing to support local authorities in driving up standards in the private rented sector?
I think what Lynn said about the staff, it becomes quite competitive when a job comes up. It means you're robbing pieces to pay Paul, going from one local authority to the other. So we do need to get some young, energetic staff. And we've got currently 2 apprentices, and we're hoping to recruit a further apprentice for this summer as well. But it's been quite hard to go through the apprentice route and to try and get that recruitment. So anything that can be done in terms of advertising by the Mayor would be great. As I mentioned before about that discretionary power as well, you know, campaigning for that as part of the levelling up agenda would be great. And I think the other thing might be good is like a support team for licensing, for large-scale licensing schemes. And as Lynn said, about 3 years in the making in terms of being able to do their large-scale application, which they're about to submit. Newham is a very similar sort of resource-intensive, even though we've had licensing for, this would be our 3rd licensing scheme we were going for, and there's no light touch approach in that respect. You know, it's still going through the same aspect as if you were starting a licensing scheme from scratch. So I think maybe the GLA could do a support team, which could actually help, because at the moment Lynn will be coming to Newham and asking our advice about how we're doing ours, and we'll be going to Haringey looking at theirs. So some sort of that shared learning across, I think, might be helpful, maybe a support through the Mayor or through the GLA.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Chair. I'm going to pass back to you as well.
You can't see the room, Assemblymember Cooper, but Vicky just has her hand up and wants to come back to you. So if that's all right, I'll leave it with you for a moment. And Vicky, do you want to?
Thank you. Just briefly, I mean, certainly the role of the PRS partnership that we've talked about before is a really important conduit for some of those conversations and that sharing of knowledge and experience when boroughs are putting in for a selective licensing scheme. But we could do so much more if the Mayor had those powers. But to pick up on some of the other things that have also been touched on, we've talked about the PRS qualification that's training 16 people this year and will be 40 people over the 2 years, over the first 2 years of the programme. We're 2/3 of the way through the first year of that, and the feedback has been excellent. And we're just going out now to recruit for year 2, and boroughs are really enthusiastic, which is a really good sign. Also through the partnership, we do ad hoc upskilling training for existing PRS teams and environmental health officers, so that they continue to be up to date with new regulations, new guidance, and other things that are of interest, speaking particularly to Lynn's point about kind of PRS officers having to be also, having to do all sorts of roles, as they are often the first people into a property. And that upskilling training enables us to do that. And also just to touch on the work that the Mayor does with the Met Police and their training. So we are providing, so we've worked with the Met Police to provide training for new frontline officers, so that they are properly equipped and understand what their responsibilities are when they attend illegal evictions, which is something that we haven't really touched on today, but is a really significant problem within the sector, both because landlords and tenants don't understand their rights and responsibilities, but also in some cases where landlords willfully mistreat or harass their tenants. So there are 3 things that I particularly wanted to touch on. But in terms of what the government can do, I mean, really ending Section 21 would be such an important step forward, not just in terms of helping renters to stay in their properties for longer, but also really empowering them to complain about poor standards and conditions, because it is that threat of eviction hanging over them that stops so many renters from pursuing kind of any sort of recourse.
Thank you. Oh, go on.
We've gone slightly beyond driving up standards, but I can see why you mentioned Section 21, because yes, I think a lot of people do hold back about reporting issues with standards because they fear the threat of eviction. But thank you very much for those additional points, and thank you for bringing in the extra speaker chair, because yes, you're right, I can't see who's got their hands up in the chamber. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much, and yeah, thank you for that point as well. I'm now going to hand over to Assembly Member Bailey for essentially the final question. So thank you all for bearing with us while we ran over a bit today.
Thank you, Chair. And as the Chair said, this is the final question. So any contributions that somebody might have, we'll try to entertain. Is there anything else you would like to say about intervention that could be best support private renters in London? Is there anything that we've missed out of the conversation? It's been quite comprehensive up to this point, but is there anything that anybody would like to add? Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, so we very briefly touched on it earlier, but housing benefit has been a bit of the elephant in the room today. We obviously had a welcome increase at the start of the pandemic for private renters, but we're back to the situation where local housing allowance is frozen, even though rents are rising, and we expect them to continue rising as the demand comes back to London. So we are very concerned that basically people's purchasing power is being eroded. That would be concerning in normal times, but add in the cost of living crisis that we have at the moment, and there are real concerns about what that's going to mean for people's ability to pay their rent, avoid homelessness, and continue to put kind of food on the table and heat in the meter. So I think it is important that we do keep encouraging government to look at the financial support they're giving low-income renters, including those low-income renters in work. There's also a separate question of the benefit cap, which can hit those in the most vulnerable positions in the private rented sector. And likewise, the restrictions to their housing benefit means that often they just cannot find something they can afford, which is why we get some of the examples of overcrowding and being forced to tolerate extremely poor standards that were alluded to at the start of the session. So yeah, just a final plea to note the dynamic of housing benefit and all of this.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Claire?
If we assume that Section 21 is going to be abolished, and let's hope that finally happens, to make sure that there isn't a kind of Section 21 via the back door that's introduced, so not bringing in like a different no-fault ground into what is proposed. My understanding is that a government proposal is around that landlords could move to evict So at the moment, you need to have more than kind of 8 weeks of rent arrears before you can start the Section 8 fault eviction process. And there are some proposals to reduce that to 4 or 6 weeks. And there's so many renters like who are going to, you know, at times fall 1 month behind on rent, and they do not deserve to be evicted from their home. And so making sure that, you know, everyone here in their powers, whatever they are, really making sure that the legislation that comes next is not just a kind of different version of Section 21 with a different name.
Thank you. Okay, Chair, looks like that's back to you.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody, particularly to members and guests for speeding up there. But I think we covered an awful lot of ground. Like I said at the beginning, we're not. It's 4 days until we enter the pre-election period. Then we're into a new term. We'll have a new chair and potentially new members on the committee as well. So it'll be for them to decide the next steps for the committee to take. But I think we've raised some really interesting issues today, and we may well follow up to each of the guests in writing for a bit more detail about some of the things that they've mentioned. But yeah, that's it really. That's the end of the question and answer session. So can we, as a committee, note the report and the discussion? And can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output, just in case we change our minds on that point in the next 3 days. And then the next meeting of the committee will be confirmed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting, when we'll find out membership of the committee as well. And then item 8, our work programme. We have a work programme to note, I believe, in the agenda. So can we note that, please?
Noted.
Thank you. And any other business? I have no urgent business, so I can thank you all again and declare this meeting to be closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.